Okay, so our case study video for this week is going to be a short video about the Comanche Empire, Mexico, and Texas. So, as you saw in the Expanding the Empire video lecture, by 1845, Texas is part of the United States. I mentioned in passing that it was an independent republic that then became part of the United States. But it's important for us to look at how Texas came about, why there were white Americans in Texas in such large numbers to begin with, and how this history is connected to the history of Mexico and the United States. And to understand any of this, we need to understand that there's a group called the Comanche Empire. And the Comanche live in a region called Comancheria, which is approximately this region as of 1840, covering a little bit of Mexico, towards what is present-day Mexico, and then other Mexican territory, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma in present-day terms. But in practice, this was not actually Mexican territory. This was Comanche territory. And in addition to Comancheria, the area they resided in, the Comanche Empire also consistently raided into an area of what is today northern Mexico. And the Comanche Empire grew their power through two major ways. One, they were very skilled diplomats at building kind of coalitions and working through diplomacy. And two, they had a powerful and feared cavalry, mounted soldiers. And using their mounted, their cavalry, the Comanche would quickly raid into Mexican ranching territory and make off with cattle and so on to grow their herds. And because of this, Mexico, which was newly independent in the 1820s, was desperately seeking a way to protect themselves and ranching in this region here, in the Comanche raiding zone, from Comanche power. And you can see here the extent of Comanche power extended even beyond that, with trading and connections all the way up towards almost what is today Canada, over towards what is today Mississippi, and almost as far down as present-day Mexico City. So there was a huge region where the Comanche controlled had significant power. So in an attempt to put somebody between Mexican ranching and Comanche power, New Spain and then Mexico start bringing in or inviting in some migrants, people to settle in the area, many of whom are Anglo, English-speaking Americans. But this really takes off through the efforts initially of two men named Moses Austin, and his son, pictured here, and his son, Stephen Austin, who you may recognize the name from the University Stephen F. Austin. You may recognize their last name from the capital of Texas, Austin. And they eventually would come to be known as impresarios. So what is an impresario? An impresario was somebody who made a deal with New Spain and then later Mexico to bring in large numbers, hundreds of American families, thousands of individuals in total, in exchange for huge grants of land from Mexico. These grants would be positioned between Mexican ranching and Comanche power in what is today Texas, basically having them form a buffer. And this was an involved process. Moses Austin kind of dies in the middle of negotiations with New Mexico, or with, sorry, New Spain. And at the same time, Mexico gains its independence from Spain. But the negotiations continue between Stephen F. Austin, Moses' son, and newly independent Mexico, both of whom have the same interests as the other institution. Like New Spain, Mexico needs a buffer between themselves and Comanche power. Like his father Moses, Stephen wants huge amounts of land for not much money. In the end, by the mid-1830s, there will be over 30 impresarios like Stephen Austin, pictured here. And the impresarios would have brought in thousands and thousands and thousands of people, mostly English-speaking Americans. And they would be given, in exchange for bringing all these migrants in to form a buffer against Comanche power, they'd be given tracts of land totaling almost the entire extent of present-day Texas, right? This is a huge amount of territory, and I think should give you a sense of how much power the Comanche Empire had, that Spain and later Mexico were willing to trade almost all of Texas in terms of land grants in exchange for putting someone between themselves and the Comanche power and Comanche Empire. But eventually, Mexico started to get worried. By 1830, less than 10 years into this deal, which really sort of takes off in 1823 or so, they close the border to Americans because they start to realize that English-speaking Americans are outnumbering Tejanos, Spanish-speaking Mexicans in Texas, about 7-1. And they start worrying that while they may be protecting themselves from the Comanche Empire, they're risking a rebellion in Texas itself against Mexico. And that's exactly what will happen. There'll be an abortive attempt to establish an American-style place called Fredonia in the 1820s. But by 1835, 1836, Texans will rise up against Mexico. There's a new person in power in Mexico, Santa Anna, and the Texans are terrified that Santa Anna is going to end slavery in Texas. And there's a history to this, right? So by the time the impresarios are coming in, Texas is an anti-slavery nation, unlike the United States. Or sorry, Mexico's an anti-slavery nation, unlike the United States. And so when these impresarios come in and bring all of these Americans, it's with the condition that they are not allowed to bring enslaved people with them. There can be no slavery in Mexican Texas. But Austin and the other impresarios simply get around this by signing enslaved people who have no choice in the matter to 99-year contracts with the exact same terms as slavery, and 99 years exceeding the lifespan of almost everyone. So effectively, they bring in slavery, even though they don't call it slavery. They're terrified that Santa Anna is going to enforce Mexico's anti-slavery laws in Texas. And so they rise up to fight. To the shock of almost everyone, they're successful due to some weird factors. And starting in 1836, there's something called the Republic of Texas, which you might also hear as the Lone Star Republic. And it exists for just over 10 years, or about 10 years, until the United States is willing to have it become a state. And early Texas has a tumultuous history. As soon as Texas gains its independence, it wants to become part of the United States. But the United States actually initially says no, because they know it'll mean war with Mexico if they take this rebellious province or state from Mexico. And they don't want war with Mexico. So Texas is in a strange position And it wants to be part of the United States, but the United States isn't taking it. Texas is living in constant fear that Mexico is going to reconquer it. Mexico is a much more powerful military in this period. Um, and so they start reaching out, and they're trying to get recognition as a nation, and they start reaching out for help. And they, especially when the United States won't accept them, they start to reach out for support from one of the other powerful English-speaking nations, Great Britain. And Great Britain says, absolutely, we'll recognize you, we'll trade with you, we'll help you on one condition. You have to end slavery, because Great Britain by this point is also an anti-slavery nation. And Texas, which at one point is basically bankrupt, terrified Mexico is going to invade them at any point, still says no. We would rather fail as a nation than abolish slavery. And so Texas is very deeply committed to slavery and cotton agriculture. And so I think that kind of feeds into what we saw in the main video lecture. So hopefully the takeaways from this brief case study are that we need to consider other actors beyond the United States in the shaping of the West, that the narrative of American expansion into Texas is really a narrative of a three-way struggle for power between the Comanche Empire, Mexico, and the United States. And the issue is over territory. Once Texas gains its independence, the issue is very much about slavery. And it sort of ties into kind of all of these other trends that we see in our course. So we're going to stop there. I'll just point you, if you're interested, to two further things. There's a book by a guy named Pekka Hamalainen. You can email me for spelling if you want, but you can easily find it just by Googling the Comanche Empire. That's the title of his book. And if you want to find out more about the Comanche Empire, he's written an entire book on this. And if you want to find out more about Mexico's position against slavery and how that shows up in the history of Texas, I encourage you to read a book by a guy named Andrew Torget, Torget, called Seeds of Empire. It's about that topic. So I'll leave you there with that. And that'll be the end of your videos for this week. And we'll see you next module.